Story 1. I was in the middle of typing an email, the sound of my fingers tapping against the keys filling the otherwise quiet room, when I heard it, a faint noise, so soft that at first, I almost brushed it off. But something in the back of my mind told me to listen. At first, I thought it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling, but then I noticed something strange, the picture frame on my desk. It had sat there for years, a steady presence in my daily routine, a simple wooden frame with a black and white photo of me and a few friends from a long-forgotten summer trip. It was one of those pleasant memories, the kind you forget about over time until something brings them back. I hadn't thought about that photo in years, but now, as I glanced up, I noticed something was off. The frame itself was making noise. A subtle, almost imperceptible sound, like glass under pressure, but wrong. Not a normal creak. I focused harder, my eyes widening as the glass in the frame began to crack. Slowly. But unmistakably. The frame was old, worn, but sturdy. It shouldn't have been doing this. And yet, there it was. The crack spread across the glass, winding like a spider's web, and with each crack, the sound grew more pronounced, like dry wood snapping under pressure. My heart started to race, a cold shiver running down my spine as I stood up from my chair, unable to look away. My feet moved toward it almost without thinking, drawn in by the bizarre, creeping horror unfolding before me. I stepped closer. The crack spread further, and with it, the unmistakable sound of something breaking. I reached out instinctively, desperate to stop it, to pull the photo out before the frame shattered completely. But as my fingers brushed the edges, I felt something I couldn't explain, a resistance. It was as if the frame were holding onto the photo, clinging to it with a strength that didn't seem possible. I jerked my hand back, my pulse racing, an ice-cold dread seeping into my bones. The crack in the glass kept expanding, each new line forming with a sharp snap that made my breath catch in my throat. The more I looked at it, the more it felt like the room was closing in on me, the air growing thick, suffocating. I could hear the buzzing now, faint but growing louder, like electricity pulsing from within the frame itself. It felt like something was alive. I backed away, heart pounding, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone off the desk. I needed to talk to someone, anyone. My voice shook as I dialed my friend, my words spilling out in a frantic rush. It's just cracking, and I don't know why. I haven't touched it, there's nothing in the room that could be causing it, I stammered, the fear taking hold of me with each passing second. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she spoke, her voice low, serious. "Jen, you need to get out of that room." Her tone sent a chill straight through me. "What?" I whispered, unable to fully grasp what she was saying. "Don't touch it. Don't go near it. Just leave. Please." I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. "But, it's just a frame," I muttered, my own words sounding hollow in my ears. "No, it's not just a frame. There's something wrong with it. I don't know what, but something's off. Just get out of there," she insisted, her voice cutting through the panic rising inside me. I turned back to the frame, my gaze snapping to it in horror. The glass was fully cracked now, but it wasn't shattered. No, the cracks were thin, precise, like they were being drawn in by some invisible hand. And then I heard it, faint at first, like a low hum, a buzzing sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't explain it, but the more I stared at the photo, the more it felt wrong. It was as if the frame wasn't just holding a memory anymore, it was watching me. Staring back at me. I stepped back slowly, the air thick with dread. The buzzing grew louder, a pressure building around me. And then, it hit me. The photo. The photo inside the frame. What if something had changed in it? I hadn't even thought to check it until now. I moved to take the frame off the desk, my hands shaking, but the moment my fingers touched the edges, the buzzing became unbearable, as though the room itself was vibrating, as if the walls were closing in on me. I tried to pull the frame away, but before I could, the glass gave way with a sharp crack, sending shards scattering across the desk. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, unable to move as the frame collapsed, the photo now exposed in the shattered remains. At first, everything seemed normal. The photo was the same, me and my friends, laughing from that summer long ago. But then, I saw it. A detail I hadn't noticed before. A shadow. In the background of the photo, something had changed. A figure, standing just behind us. Too close to be part of the scenery. And it wasn't one of my friends. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the breath catching in my throat. The shadow, it wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. It was as if someone had placed it there, deliberately, standing just behind us. My eyes couldn't leave it, the figure growing darker, more defined with each passing second. It felt like it was moving. Coming closer. Then, I heard it. A whisper. My own voice, but faint, so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. Get out. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the room was empty. The whisper faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence. I looked back at the desk, at the shattered frame, at the photo now lying exposed before me. The shadow, still present in the background, seemed to be waiting for something. For me. Story 2. It had been one of those quiet nights, the kind where the world outside seems still, and the only sound in the house is the faint hum of the refrigerator. I had just finished my evening routine and was ready to settle in for the night. The house felt peaceful, eerily so, but there was a sense of something waiting, something just beneath the surface. I moved to my bedroom, the soft carpet beneath my feet, the familiar space offering little comfort as I reached for the curtains to look outside. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the window, standing perfectly still, was a figure. A shadowy silhouette, barely visible against the ink-black night, its form indistinct, yet somehow, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen. My heart thundered in my chest as a cold wave of panic washed over me. I didn't know who or what it was, but I could feel it, its eyes, heavy and unblinking, fixed on me from the dark. I blinked, trying to clear the fog in my tired eyes, but when I opened them again, the figure was gone. Vanished, as though it had never been there at all. My pulse was erratic, but I quickly forced myself to breathe, peering into the yard, scanning the shadows for any trace of movement. Nothing. Just the empty lawn, bathed in the dull glow of the streetlight, the breeze making the trees sway softly. I exhaled, telling myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe, or my tired eyes playing games. But deep down, that whispering feeling of dread settled in, gnawing at my mind. I pulled the curtains shut, trying to shake off the unease, but it lingered, crawling under my skin. Lying in bed, I couldn't escape the image of the figure, its stillness unsettling in a way that felt wrong. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, that I had nothing to worry about. But the longer I lay there, the heavier the room felt, as if the air itself had thickened, suffocating me with an invisible weight. The silence became unbearable, a constant reminder that something was out of place. I pulled the covers tighter around me, hoping the darkness would swallow my thoughts, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. That figure, standing just outside, watching me with a silent, oppressive presence. I tried to shake the image away, but it was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Around midnight, I couldn't stand it anymore. Maybe it had just been someone walking by, a stranger or a neighbor, I tried to reason with myself. But the thought of it kept me on edge, so I got up, moving through the house with trembling hands. Every light was switched on, every window checked, every door locked. Everything was in place, just as it should be. Still, the feeling of being watched never left me. I returned to bed, but sleep felt impossible. Every creak of the house, every tiny sound, set my heart racing. I must have dozed off, but then I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. At first, it was soft, a faint tap, almost like a breeze brushing the glass, but it grew louder, more insistent. Tap, 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 each beat a slow, deliberate rhythm, closer and closer. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and slowly turned toward the window. There it was again. The figure. This time, it was closer. More distinct. It was the same shadow I had seen earlier, but now, it was almost too clear, its outline sharp and unmistakable against the dark. I could make out the form of a figure, tall and unmoving, but there were no features, no face, just an empty silhouette that seemed to grow darker the longer I stared. My body refused to move. My legs felt like stone, my breath shallow, frozen in terror. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound would come. The tapping continued, more rhythmic now, each tap like a slow, deliberate knock at my sanity. I wanted to look away, to escape, but I couldn't. Every time I blinked or tried to turn, the figure only seemed to get closer, its form becoming more defined, more real in the darkness. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help, but the screen remained black, as if the power had been drained from it. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears as the silence stretched on, oppressive and thick. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. With a burst of adrenaline, I leapt from the bed, my legs finally responding, and bolted for the door. I ran down the hallway, my breath ragged, the pounding of my heart loud in my chest. I needed to get out, I needed to escape, but when I reached the front door, I froze. There it was. The figure. Standing just inside the doorway, its form more solid now, its presence more menacing, as if it had been waiting for me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The air was thick with dread, suffocating me in the small space between us. How had it gotten inside? How had it moved so quickly, without a sound? My mind raced, desperate for any explanation, but there was none. Only the shadow, looming larger and darker with each passing second. I took a step back, but it didn't move. It just stayed there, watching, its presence so heavy it felt like the very walls were closing in on me. I turned and ran, bolting for the nearest exit, not looking back until I was outside, standing on the front porch, gasping for breath. The night was still. The air cold. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The figure was gone. I never went back inside that night. I couldn't. I went to a friend's house and stayed there until morning, shaken to my core by what I had experienced. I never saw the figure again, and over time, I convinced myself that it had all been some kind of hallucination, or a nightmare I couldn't fully remember. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had been there. Something had been watching me. And I was sure it hadn't left. Story 3. I was sitting alone on the couch, the dim light from the lamp beside me casting a soft glow across the room. It had been a quiet evening, just me, the silence, and my own wandering thoughts. The low hum of the fridge was the only sound that filled the space, a gentle reminder of the stillness around me. I reached for the remote, intending to turn on the TV and let the noise drown out my thoughts. But just as my fingers hovered over the buttons, the screen flickered to life on its own. I froze. The faint buzz of static filled the air, its uninvited hum a sharp contrast to the peaceful quiet that had surrounded me moments before. The TV, which had always been a bit temperamental, seemed to be malfunctioning as it usually did, but something about this felt different, unnerving, even. The static continued, growing louder, more persistent, until it seemed to fill the room entirely, drowning out everything else. For a moment, I wondered if the wiring had shorted out or if the TV was just having one of its usual glitches. But as I moved to stand up and investigate, the static cleared, and then it happened. My own face appeared on the screen. I stood there, heart pounding, unable to look away. My own face, frozen in time, stared back at me. My eyes were wide, almost frantic, and my mouth hung open, as though I had been caught mid-sentence. But I wasn't even near the TV. I hadn't moved, hadn't done anything to explain why the screen was showing my face, so vividly, so unsettlingly. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I blinked hard, but the image didn't change. It stayed there, my expression frozen in that strange, almost desperate look. My skin appeared unnaturally pale, my eyes too dark, as if the reflection wasn't truly mine. It was me, yes, but twisted, distorted, a version of myself that wasn't quite right. The longer I stared at the screen, the more unsettling it became. It was as though my face was shifting ever so slightly, barely perceptible, but unmistakable, a slow, unnatural breathing, a subtle movement that couldn't possibly have been real. My stomach churned, and I stood up, legs shaky, moving closer to the screen despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The details of my face grew sharper, too sharp. The eyes were off, the lips curled in a grimace that wasn't mine. It looked like someone had taken a photo of me, but not at the moment I remembered. No, it was a photo manipulated, twisted, something wrong with it. Just as I reached out to touch the screen, to turn it off and end this bizarre nightmare, something impossible happened. The face blinked. I staggered back, my breath catching in my chest, a chill running through me. I could have sworn it blinked, my own face, on a screen, blinking at me. Panic surged through me, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I had to turn it off. I had to stop this. I searched desperately for the remote, but it was nowhere to be found. My heart was racing as I reached for the power button on the TV itself. I pressed it, over and over, but nothing happened. The screen flickered again, brief static followed by my face, this time, contorting. It was no longer just my face. The smile that stretched across my reflection was wide, far too wide, impossibly wide, the corners of the mouth pulling back to the point that the skin seemed ready to tear. It wasn't my smile anymore, it was something else. Something malicious. Something that didn't belong there. I backed away slowly, my legs barely holding me up as the smile grew wider, distorting further. The screen flickered again, showing flashes of images, places I'd never been, faces I didn't recognize, and then, terrifyingly, flashes of my own reflection, each one more twisted than the last. The buzzing noise became unbearable now, louder, more jarring, filling the room like a warning. And then I saw it. Behind my face, lurking in the shadows of the static, was a figure. Its form was too blurred to make out, but it was there, moving closer to the screen. My heart skipped, the air turning suddenly cold, thick with dread. It wasn't just watching. It was waiting. The figure grew closer, inching toward me, its shape becoming more defined, though still no features emerged. It was just a shadow, an outline, something wrong, something I couldn't quite grasp. My blood ran cold. I turned and bolted for the door, fumbling with the handle as panic took hold. I had to get out, had to escape that suffocating atmosphere that hung thick in the room. As I slammed the door behind me, I ran outside into the night, the cold air a sharp contrast to the warmth of the house I had just fled. For hours, I paced back and forth, trying to shake off the terror that clung to me. I tried to convince myself it had all been a trick of the mind, a nightmare, a delusion, but the image of my distorted face, the smile that wasn't mine, stayed with me. It haunted me. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to face whatever that thing was, whatever had been on the screen, but the pull of the house was too strong. With a shaky breath, I gathered what little courage I had left and walked back in, praying that when I turned off the TV, the nightmare would end. The light in the living room was still dim, the TV still on, still showing my face, but this time, it was different. This time, it was me, sitting in my own living room, staring at the TV, just as I had been moments before. And then, from the screen itself, in a whisper so soft it seemed to come from deep within the static, I heard it. "I've been waiting for you." And that was when I understood, this wasn't just a trick. It wasn't just a malfunction. Whatever had been on that screen, whatever had been watching me, knew me, and it wasn't finished yet. Story 4. I was cleaning out an old box in the attic when I stumbled upon it, an envelope with my name on it. The handwriting was unmistakable, yet unsettling. It was addressed to me, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't my handwriting, and it certainly wasn't anyone I knew. The letters were neat, precise, almost deliberate in a way that felt too personal for a stranger, but too unfamiliar for anyone I trusted. The envelope, worn and yellowed with age, seemed to have been handled 100 times. Yet, it had never been opened. I stared at it for a long moment, my fingers frozen on its edges. The weight of the envelope felt wrong, heavier than it should have been. It was as though there was more inside it than just paper, like it held something I wasn't meant to find. My heart began to race, pounding in my chest as my mind spun with possibilities. Who could have sent this? Why would anyone send me a letter? And why did the handwriting feel so strange? So foreign? I turned the envelope over, hoping to find a return address, some clue as to where it had come from, but there was nothing. Just a blank, smooth back. No stamp, no date, no postmark. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. The air around me grew thick with unease, and my fingers trembled as I cautiously slid the letter from its confines. The paper was old, fragile, and I treated it like it might disintegrate in my hands. As I unfolded it, the first words leapt off the page, "Don't look back." A chill ran down my spine. My breath caught in my throat. What could this possibly mean? Who would send a letter with such a cryptic, ominous message? My hands were shaking now, and I turned the page, desperate to understand, to make sense of it all. The rest of the letter was short, its words seared into my mind with a chilling clarity. "You've been watching too closely. You're not the only one who's been here." The room grew colder, the temperature dropping several degrees in an instant. I could almost hear the silence vibrating in the air around me. I stood motionless, the letter in my hands, but the dread inside me told me that the words were more than just a message, they were a warning. A warning that I wasn't alone, that something had been watching me, something I hadn't noticed before, something I couldn't explain. My gaze swept over the attic, the shadows stretching long across the walls in the dim light. The house, which had always been a place of comfort, now felt like a trap. The silence, once so peaceful, now felt suffocating. The letter in my hands felt like a burden I wasn't prepared to carry. My mind raced as I tried to understand the meaning behind the words. Who was watching me? What did they mean by, "You're not the only one who's been here"? I looked back at the letter, scanning the words again, but they made no more sense than before. Just words on a page, yet they felt like they held some kind of power I couldn't comprehend. I folded the letter carefully, my fingers numb with the weight of it. I felt, that I wasn't supposed to have read it. Like I had unlocked something, a secret I wasn't meant to uncover. With the letter still clenched in my hand, I left the attic, my mind swirling with confusion and fear. The house, once so familiar, now felt foreign, its walls closing in around me. Each shadow seemed darker, each creak of the floorboards louder than ever before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me. I placed the letter on the kitchen counter, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. The words "Don't look back" echoed in my mind, growing louder and more insistent. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I had been ignoring, the strange noises in the walls, the unsettling feeling of being watched, the inexplicable cold spots in the house. Had all of this been connected? I didn't want to believe it, but the gnawing feeling in my gut told me I was wrong to dismiss it. Something wasn't right. That night, I lay awake in bed, the darkness pressing in around me, suffocating and oppressive. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside felt like a warning, a message I couldn't decipher. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something in this house, something that wasn't supposed to be here. The next morning, unable to shake the feeling that something was amiss, I returned to the attic. My nerves were on edge, every step on the creaky stairs setting my heart racing. The attic was just as I had left it, the dusty shelves and old boxes untouched. But as my eyes scanned the room, something caught my attention, something I had missed before. In the far corner, tucked under an old blanket, was a small, faded photograph. I didn't remember seeing it there, but when I picked it up, a cold shiver ran through me. It was a photo of me, taken from behind, standing in the hallway of the house. My back was to the camera, but that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the figure standing just behind me, in the shadows, almost hidden from view. A figure I hadn't seen before. A figure that wasn't supposed to be there. The walls of the attic seemed to close in on me. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and I couldn't breathe. The letter, the photograph, the feeling of being watched, it was all connected. But what did it mean? Who had been here before me? And why hadn't I noticed? I bolted down the stairs, the photograph clenched tightly in my hands, the house around me now feeling like a prison. It was as if the walls themselves were hiding something, holding secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. My pulse hammered in my ears as I raced for the door, desperate to escape, to flee before it was too late. But as I reached the threshold, I felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of someone standing just behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Story 5. It was an early morning, the kind where the sun hadn't quite reached full strength yet, casting soft, golden light through the window. My eyes fluttered open, still heavy with the remnants of a restless night. Without thinking, I reached for my phone, as I usually did, to check the time and maybe scroll through messages. But as I unlocked the screen, something was wrong. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a strange anomaly that I thought was just a trick of the sleep in my eyes. There, at the top of my screen, was a countdown timer. It was ticking away, with numbers slowly ticking down to something I couldn't comprehend. 7 days, 12 hours, 45 minutes. No label. No explanation. Nothing that made sense. My heart began to thud in my chest as I stared at it. Maybe it was just a glitch, I thought, some app malfunction. But the more I looked at it, the more unsettling it became. There was no reason for it to be there. It wasn't something I had set. It was just there. The timer was counting down to something, and I had no idea what it was or why it was happening to me. A slow, creeping sense of dread washed over me. A cold feeling that seemed to settle deep in my bones. I tried to shake it off, but the thought lingered, what if it was some kind of warning? A countdown to something terrible. Something I couldn't prevent. My mind raced with wild ideas. A hacker? Or worse, something far more sinister. Desperate to make sense of it, I opened every app one could think of, calendar, reminders, third-party apps, but there was nothing. No event, no reminder, no clue as to why the timer had appeared. I checked the settings. Nothing. It was as if it had appeared from nowhere, a mystery I couldn't solve. My pulse quickened, my thoughts spiraling. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was counting down to, I had no control over. I turned off my phone, hoping that would stop the maddening countdown. When I powered it back on, my blood ran cold. The timer was still there, ticking away relentlessly, unaffected by my attempt to shut it down. Panic surged within me. How was this possible? I was the only one who had access to my phone. No one else could have set this up. I called my friend, hoping for a logical explanation, some kind of clarity. I briefly told her about the timer, and she suggested it was just a software bug. It sounded reasonable, too reasonable, but something deep inside me knew that wasn't it. I wasn't just imagining it. She said she would check her own phone, but as I ended the call, I felt more alone than ever. No one else was experiencing what I was, and the countdown was mine to face. Alone. Hours passed in a haze, my mind unable to focus. Every time I glanced at the phone, my stomach twisted. The countdown was still there, ticking away, growing closer. 6 days, 23 hours, and 30 minutes. Time was running out, but I couldn't figure out what it was running out for. As the evening came, I could feel the weight of the countdown pressing on me. It consumed me. I couldn't escape it. It was like an invisible hand, squeezing tighter and tighter with each passing moment. My attempts to reset my phone were futile. Nothing would stop the timer. It was a countdown to, what? I couldn't even imagine. Every second that ticked by felt like it was pulling me towards something I couldn't control, something I couldn't escape. The fear had taken over. It was suffocating. The day stretched on, dragging me deeper into the unknown. The unknown date, the endless ticking, the ever-looming sense of doom, it was driving me mad. I tried talking to my family about it, but they didn't understand. They dismissed it as some technical issue, something that would fix itself. But it wasn't just some technical issue. It felt like a warning, a sinister omen I couldn't escape. That night, I barely slept. The countdown haunted my every thought. What was it counting down to? Was it an event? A deadline? Or something worse? The fear twisted inside me, gnawing at my nerves. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the timer in my mind, relentless and unstoppable. The next day, the sense of impending dread was unbearable. The countdown was getting closer. Hours left. I couldn't pretend anymore. I was on edge. I snapped at people for no reason. The world around me didn't make sense. The timer was my only reality. My phone had become a ticking time bomb, and I had no idea when or how it would explode. Then, with mere hours left, the atmosphere shifted. It was as if time itself had slowed down, the air thick with tension. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the screen, unable to look away. What would happen when the timer reached 0? I braced myself for the unknown, my mind spiraling into panic. Finally, the last second arrived. The countdown hit its final moment. The timer hit 0. And then, nothing. The phone buzzed. I froze, expecting something, anything. A message. A notification. But no. The timer simply disappeared. It was gone. Vanished as if it had never existed. For a moment, a fleeting moment, I felt a strange relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe I was free. But then my phone buzzed again. A new notification. I opened it without thinking, and my heart sank. It's only just begun. The room grew colder. The weight of those words hit me like a ton of bricks. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't over. It had only just started. Story 6. I had never been one for oddities or things that lingered uncomfortably in the back of my mind, but that was before the receipt appeared in my wallet. It was a crumpled, faded scrap of paper that seemed to defy all reason. I didn't remember slipping it into my purse, but there it was, its edges torn and its ink slightly smudged. The date on it was from months ago, and the store listed, I couldn't place it. Not even a familiar name. My fingers trembled as I read the total, an amount far larger than anything I would have spent in one sitting. The item? It was something I had never seen before, a luxury item that seemed too extravagant for me to even consider. Yet, there it was. I couldn't recall making any such purchase, no trips to any store matching that name. My mind raced, trying to piece together any scenario where I might have bought it, but the answers eluded me. The more I stared at that receipt, the more a chilling realization began to creep in. I was certain I hadn't spent that money. I couldn't have. I turned the receipt over in my hand, desperately searching for something, anything, that could unlock the mystery. But there was nothing. Just the store's faded logo, a barcode, and a timestamp that seemed almost mocking in its simplicity. I set the receipt down, trying to convince myself it was just a mistake, a moment of forgetfulness. Maybe I had sleepwalked into the store or was too tired to remember. But even as I thought it, the notion felt wrong. I wasn't the type to lose track of things, especially not something this significant. To double-check, I pulled up my bank statements, hoping there'd be some sign that I had indeed made the purchase. But there was nothing. No record of the transaction. No trace of the money leaving my account. It was as if it had never happened at all. The following day, against my better judgment, I went to the store listed on the receipt. It was small, tucked between a row of shops I passed by regularly but never noticed. The sign above the door was faded, nearly illegible. I hesitated before pushing the door open. It groaned in protest as I stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of dust and something ancient. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with old books, strange trinkets, and knickknacks that felt like they'd been forgotten by time. Behind the counter, a clerk sat, his gaze heavy as he looked up at me, his face unreadable. My throat tightened. I didn't know what to say, how to explain this growing unease that gnawed at me. I showed him the receipt, asked if he remembered me making a purchase. His eyes flickered over the paper and then back to me. His expression never changed. "I don't know," he said, his voice devoid of any real emotion. "You might have." I didn't know what to make of that answer. It wasn't helpful, yet it wasn't dismissive either. There was something in the way he said it, like it was something he had heard before. Something that wasn't unusual. I left the store feeling more unsettled than before, a creeping dread curling in my stomach. The next few days blurred together in a haze of strange occurrences. Little things at first, nothing outright sinister, but enough to make my skin crawl. My wallet, which I kept tucked securely in my bag, would be in a different place when I opened it. My phone would light up at odd hours, missed calls from unfamiliar numbers. And then, one day, there was a letter in my mailbox, no return address, just a simple card that read, "It's not over." I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all connected. That the moment I had found that receipt, something had shifted, something had crossed a line. It was as if I had unknowingly triggered something I couldn't escape from, and now it was following me. No matter where I went, I could feel it lurking in the corners of my life, just out of sight. A week later, I went back to the store, determined to find some answers. When I entered, the air was heavier than before. The shelves, once neatly arranged, now looked neglected, as though they hadn't been touched in days. The dust had accumulated thickly, clinging to the forgotten objects. The clerk was there, barely acknowledging my presence. "I need to know what happened when I bought this," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Why don't I remember? Why is there no record of it?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he stared at me, his eyes narrowing as if he was weighing something in his mind. And then, with a soft, almost pitying smile, he spoke, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, the words slow and deliberate, as though savoring them. "You've already paid the price." His voice sent a shiver down my spine, and I recoiled, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you mean?" I whispered, the fear in my throat almost choking me. "What did I buy?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a string. He placed it in front of me. "Take it," he said, his voice low. "It's yours." I didn't want to take it. Something inside of me screamed not to, but I knew, deep down, I had no choice. My hands trembled as I untied the string. Inside was a small, intricately carved wooden figurine, old and worn, as though it had been passed down through generations. There was something deeply familiar about it, yet I couldn't place why. As soon as my fingers brushed the figurine, a sharp pain shot through my chest, as if something inside me had been stabbed. I gasped and dropped it, clutching my chest. The pain faded almost as quickly as it had come, but it left behind a deep sense of unease, a lingering dread that I couldn't shake. The clerk didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I stepped back, backing away from the counter, away from the figurine. As I turned to leave, I heard him whisper, his voice barely audible, but it sliced through the air like a warning, "It's already too late." I fled the store, my heart pounding, my breath ragged. I never went back. But the box, the figurine, it stayed with me. I locked it away, hidden in a drawer where I thought I could forget. But every time I glance at it, that sharp pain in my chest returns, and I know, deep down, that whatever I bought that day, whatever price I've paid, I can never undo it. The cost is more than I can understand, and I fear that I'm only beginning to comprehend the horrors it has set in motion. Story 7. I had just settled into the couch, the gentle hum of the television breaking the silence of an otherwise quiet house. It had been one of those long, exhausting days, and all I wanted was to unwind, to forget about the world outside, and simply relax. The house was empty, as usual, just me, alone in my little bubble of space. But that peaceful solitude didn't last long. Out of nowhere, I heard it. A voice. At first, it was so faint I thought I might have imagined it. It was like a whisper coming from the farthest corner of the house, upstairs. But then the words came clearer, unmistakable, a quiet urgency in the tone. "Hey, come here." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I knew no one was upstairs. The front door had been locked when I came in, and I hadn't heard anyone else enter. There was no reason anyone should be up there. But the voice? It was as clear as day. My mind spun, trying to find some rational explanation. Maybe it was the house settling, or the TV playing tricks with the sound, but deep down, I knew. I wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but this felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stared at the staircase, my eyes tracing the shadows that hung heavy in the silence between the walls. It felt suffocating, like the house was holding its breath. After what felt like an eternity, I stood up, each movement slow and deliberate, as if my body knew something I didn't want to admit. My feet felt like lead, the weight of the situation dragging me down with every step. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer. Only the dead stillness of the house. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. I reached the base of the stairs, my gaze lifting toward the darkened second floor. The faint light from the living room barely reached up there, leaving the upper staircase swallowed in shadows. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anything, but I felt it, something was waiting. I took another step. My hand gripped the banister, cold to the touch, colder than usual, almost as if the air upstairs had shifted, had changed somehow. I called my name, my voice barely above a whisper, as if trying to reassure myself, trying to convince my racing heart that it was all just in my head. But then, it happened again. "Come upstairs." The voice. It was clearer this time. And there was something about it, something that didn't belong. It wasn't my voice, it wasn't anyone I recognized. It was the kind of sound that felt too real, too close, like someone was standing just beyond my sight. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice barely a whisper. The silence answered me, thick and suffocating. It hung in the air like a warning, a presence I couldn't see but could feel pressing in on me. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, torn. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave, to run far away and never look back. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, kept me rooted to the spot. I waited. And just when I thought it might be over, I heard it again. This time, it was louder. Closer. "Why aren't you coming up?" My blood ran cold. I spun around, heart racing, but when I looked, the room behind me was empty. The same emptiness I had left behind when I'd sat down earlier. Nothing had changed. Nothing except the sound of that voice. I backed away from the stairs, slowly, as though even the slightest movement might provoke whatever was lurking in the dark. I returned to the couch, but my mind raced, trying to find an explanation. Maybe it was the house, settling. Maybe it was the acoustics. But the voice? The voice had sounded too real, too vivid to dismiss. The night dragged on in a haze, the house eerily silent save for the occasional shifting shadows in the corners of my vision. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. But no other sounds came. No more voices. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a product of my tired mind. It was just a fleeting moment, nothing more. But as I was cleaning, something caught my eye. The door to my bedroom, which I always left slightly ajar, was now wide open. The air inside felt different. Colder. There was a heaviness in the room, as if something had been there, waiting. I quickly shut the door, trying to ignore the unease that crept through me. The feeling of being drawn into something I didn't fully understand, lingered. That night, when I settled back into the living room, I thought maybe it was all over. But no. It came again, soft but unmistakable. Come upstairs. I didn't want to respond. I didn't want to acknowledge the voice. But it felt like it was calling me directly, pulling me in, drawing me toward it. I knew I shouldn't go upstairs. I didn't want to go up. I didn't want to face whatever it was. But against my better judgment, my legs moved me forward, one step at a time. Just as I reached the top, the figure vanished. Gone. As if it had never been there. I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest, and without thinking, I ran. I ran out of that house, not stopping until I was far, far away. That night, I stayed away for hours, too terrified to return. And when I finally did, the house was quiet. Too quiet. There were no voices, no shadows lurking in the corners. It seemed like everything had returned to normal. But I knew. I knew it wasn't. Whatever had called me, whatever had been waiting upstairs, was still there. Watching. And I would never forget the sound of that voice calling me home. Story 8. I had just stepped out of the shower, the steam still thick in the air, clinging to my skin like an oppressive weight. But it wasn't the heat that made me shiver, it was what I saw next. A strange, jagged mark had appeared on my arm, just above my elbow. At first, I thought it was some kind of trick of the light or my skin reacting to something, but no. The mark was real. It wasn't there before, at least, I was certain it wasn't. My skin was slightly raised, and the mark itself seemed to almost burn into my flesh, as though it had been seared into me by something or someone. My fingers trembled as I ran them over it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't like any scar I'd ever seen. There was no memory of injuring myself, no explanation that made sense. I leaned closer to the mirror, squinting, trying to decipher it. It was jagged, almost like an odd symbol, something that made my heart skip a beat. It looked carved, like someone had gone to the trouble of marking me on purpose, like some kind of message I wasn't meant to understand. I circled the mark from every angle, my mind desperately trying to recall when it could have happened. But no memory surfaced, no accident, no sharp object, no reason for it. The more I thought about it, the more confused I became, the more disturbed I felt. How could a mark like that just appear out of nowhere? I touched it again, and the strange, raised texture sent a chill down my spine. It felt like it had been there for days, or weeks, but I'd never noticed it before. That thought, the one that wouldn't leave me alone, burrowed under my skin like a parasite. What if this wasn't just some random skin irritation? No, this felt different. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. As I backed away from the mirror, a wave of unease flooded over me. I told myself it was nothing, a rash or irritation, something I'd missed in my daily routine. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The mark was alive in some way, like it was trying to say something, trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to understand. I hurried to pull on a shirt, trying to hide the mark from view, but even as the fabric covered it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't imagining it. This was no random skin blemish. I had to find out what it meant. I called my best friend, desperate for any kind of explanation. I told them everything, my voice shaking more than I wanted to admit. But they just brushed it off, suggesting it was nothing more than a weird rash or irritation. I knew better. This wasn't just a rash. This wasn't just in my head. As the day wore on, the mark began to burn, just a faint warmth radiating from it, though nothing about it seemed to change. But the sensation was unmistakable. I couldn't push the thoughts away any longer. What if it wasn't just a mark? What if it was something more? Something I wasn't supposed to understand? That night, as I lay in bed, the darkness felt wrong. It wasn't just dark, it was thicker, colder. Even though the heat outside should have kept the room warm, a chill settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something, or someone, was there with me. I turned over, trying to shake the unease, but that's when I felt it. A faint pulse, a thrum, coming from the mark on my arm. My breath caught in my throat. It was alive. It wasn't just there anymore, it felt like it was trying to communicate, like it was trying to tell me something I should have known. I shot out of bed, heart pounding in my chest, and rushed to the bathroom, flicking on the light. The mark was still there, but now it seemed darker, more pronounced. It was like it was spreading, crawling across my skin in slow, deliberate waves. I felt a sickening wave of nausea hit me as I stared at it, unable to comprehend what was happening. What was happening? Why was this happening to me? I couldn't stay in the house another minute. I grabbed my coat and shoes and rushed outside into the cold night air, hoping the chill would clear my head. But as I walked down the empty street, the feeling of being followed never left me. I turned around once, twice, nothing. But it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, and the mark on my arm, it was calling to me. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing through the silent street, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was drawing me toward something. I couldn't stop myself. I had to keep going. I needed to know what it was. By the time I reached the park, the pulse from the mark was stronger, almost unbearable. My mind was clouded with fear, but my legs carried me forward. Something inside me told me I had no choice. I had to see this through. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows. Watching me. My heart hammered in my chest. The figure stepped forward, and I saw their face, or rather, I saw something that wasn't a face I recognized. Their eyes were cold, calculating, as if they could see right into me. As if they knew exactly what I was thinking, what I was feeling. You shouldn't have ignored it, they said, their voice low and deliberate. Their gaze flicked to the mark on my arm, and I felt a cold chill settle deep in my bones. What do you mean? I whispered, my voice trembling. The person didn't answer directly. Instead, they raised a hand, pointing at my arm. You're not the first to have it, they said, their voice echoing in the silence. But you'll be the last. Before I could respond, the mark flared up, sending a sharp pain shooting through my body. I screamed, falling to my knees as the agony intensified. The world around me blurred. I thought I might pass out, but then, just as suddenly as it started, the pain stopped. I looked down at my arm. The mark was gone. The skin was smooth, without a trace of the symbol that had been there just moments before. The person in front of me, gone. Vanished, like they had never been there at all. I stood up, my legs shaking, unsure of what had just happened. Was it real? Was any of it real? I turned and walked back home, the mark gone, but the feeling of being watched still clinging to me. When I reached my door, I noticed something strange. The door was ajar, just barely. I had locked it before I left. The mark might have disappeared, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was still watching me. And I had no idea how to escape it. Story 9. I had just gotten home, tired from the day, when something caught my eye, a package sitting on my doorstep. My first instinct was to ignore it. After all, I hadn't ordered anything. But something about the way it was just there, waiting for me, made my pulse quicken. It was a small box, unmarked, with my name written across the front in bold, dark letters, the ink almost too sharp, too precise. I stood there for a moment, the air suddenly colder. I couldn't think of anyone who would be sending me something, at least not without giving me a heads up. I didn't have any upcoming deliveries, and yet here this box was, plain, nondescript, with no return address. A strange, uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, but curiosity gnawed at me. I reached for it, lifting it off the ground, the cardboard feeling unusually sturdy in my hands. It was light enough, but something about it just felt wrong. I brought it inside and set it down on the kitchen table, my mind racing as I examined the box again. It looked so ordinary, almost too ordinary, and yet, a sense of foreboding filled the room. The house was silent, save for the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I could almost hear my heartbeat thudding in my ears as I slowly peeled back the tape. My fingers trembled as I lifted the top flap. Inside, nestled carefully in soft, velvet-like fabric, was a small pouch. My breath caught in my throat. The pouch was cold to the touch, and I had no idea why it felt so chilling. I opened it, and what I found inside made my heart stop. A key. An antique-looking key, heavy in my palm, with intricate carvings along its shaft. It was made of some kind of dark, almost black metal, the designs unfamiliar and strange. There was no note, no explanation. Just that key, lying there like it had always belonged to me. I turned the key over in my hand, searching for some clue, anything that might tell me its purpose. But there was nothing. No symbol, no inscription. It just was. My fingers felt cold, as though the key was pulling something out of me, something I couldn't explain. I set the key down on the table, a gnawing sense of unease settling deep in my chest. It felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in my world. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something far beyond my understanding, lingering just out of sight. I tried to ignore it. For days, I did my best to put it from my mind, but every time I passed by the kitchen, my eyes would fall on it. It sat there, silent and unmoving, but I could feel it calling to me. As if it knew I was coming. Then, one night, I woke up to a soft tapping. It was faint at first, almost like a knock. The sound drifted in from somewhere outside, though I couldn't place it. I crept to the window, assuming it was just the wind, but when I pulled the curtains back, there was nothing there. The night stretched out in stillness, the streetlights casting an eerie glow on the empty yard. But then I saw it. There, on the windowsill. The key. I froze. It wasn't there when I went to bed. It had been on the kitchen table, and now it was here. My heart raced as I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, a shiver ran down my spine. I didn't understand how it had moved, or why, but there it was. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it again, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I should throw it away. But the thought only made me more uneasy, as if getting rid of it would somehow make things worse. So, I kept it. And then it started. The key began to appear in places where it shouldn't have been. On the kitchen counter, the living room table, even in the bathroom. Each time I found it, my unease grew. It was as if the key was waiting for me to do something. But what? I ransacked my house, searching for any lock that it might fit. Every drawer, every door, every box, nothing. The more I searched, the more I felt like I was losing control. My home began to feel smaller, the walls pressing in on me. Desperation clawed at me. I needed to find the place the key fit. I had to. Then, one afternoon, it happened. The key appeared on the coffee table. I hadn't seen it in hours, and I certainly hadn't placed it there. It was just there. But now, there was something different. Something darker. The key seemed to hum with a strange energy, like it was vibrating beneath my fingertips. As soon as I touched it, I heard it, a faint click, the unmistakable sound of a lock turning, though I couldn't tell from where. The room grew colder, the lights flickering overhead. My heart thudded in my chest, and a wave of terror washed over me. The key had activated something, but what? Without thinking, I grabbed it again. The pull, the compulsion to do something with it, was unbearable. It led me to the back door. My hand shook as I inserted the key into the lock, the metal turning with a sickening smoothness. The door creaked open. Beyond it was darkness. But it wasn't just any darkness, it was thick, pressing against me, making the air heavy in my lungs. The familiar yard now looked wrong. Twisted. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching out toward me. I couldn't go back now. I stepped outside, the night air wrapping around me like cold fingers. The world blurred, like reality itself was warping. I knew, without a doubt, that I had opened something that was never meant to be opened. And now, there was no turning back. Story 10. It was a crisp morning, the air cool against my skin as I made my way to the mailbox, the sun still low in the sky. It cast long, ghostly shadows across the yard, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the weight of the quiet, like the world was holding its breath. As I approached the box and opened the cold metal door, I expected the usual, bills, flyers, maybe a letter or two, but there was only one piece of mail inside. It was a small, plain envelope, unmarked, with no return address. My name was scrawled neatly across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. A frown tugged at my lips. Who would send me something so cryptic? There was an odd thickness to the envelope, a weight to it that didn't sit right. It felt like there was more inside than just a letter. My curiosity got the best of me, and I pulled it out. The edges of the envelope were slightly torn, almost as if it had been hastily sealed shut. I didn't know why, but something about that felt wrong, like whoever had sent it had been in a hurry. With trembling hands, I ripped the envelope open, and inside, there was a single, folded piece of paper. I hesitated for a moment, my breath shallow as I unfolded it, the paper crinkling in my hands. The words inside were written in the same neat, almost pristine handwriting. I'm closer than you think. A cold shiver crawled down my spine. The words themselves weren't threatening, but the weight of them settled deep in my chest. A gnawing feeling washed over me, the air around me suddenly feeling colder, older, as though the sunlight that had been so warm just moments ago had been swallowed up by the words themselves. My heart pounded as I stood there, staring at the note. What did it mean? And who would leave something like this? I glanced around the yard, half expecting to see someone lurking in the distance, watching me. But there was nothing. Just the quiet of the morning, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant song of birds in the trees. I looked back down at the note, my mind racing, trying to piece it together. Closer than you think. But closer to what? To me? My chest tightened, my body tense, as I quickly folded the note back up and shoved it into my pocket. The unease crawled beneath my skin, a sensation that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. I walked back to the house, my eyes darting over my shoulder more than once. I half expected to see someone following me, but there was nothing, just the empty morning air. Once inside, I locked the door behind me, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just some prank or a fluke. But the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. I set the note down on the kitchen counter and began pacing, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. How did they know where I lived? Who could have written this? I tried to push it aside, to focus on the mundane, to go about my morning routine. The familiar sounds of coffee brewing and the gentle rhythm of getting dressed should have been comforting, but everything felt different. The house, which had always been a safe haven, now felt like a foreign place. Something had shifted. I grabbed my phone, checked the time. Just past 7. I tried to tell myself it was too early for anything to be wrong, that maybe I was just being paranoid. But the feeling didn't go away. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside, felt amplified. The shadows in the corners of my vision seemed to move, to stretch and grow, as if something was waiting, lurking just out of sight. The hours crawled by, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. By noon, I had convinced myself it was nothing, just a weird prank from a neighbor, maybe someone who knew I lived alone. But when I went to check the mailbox again in the afternoon, my stomach dropped. There it was, another envelope. This one was even stranger. Unmarked, but the same thick paper, the same familiar handwriting. I didn't open it immediately. My heart raced in my chest as I stared at the envelope, terror creeping up my spine. With shaky hands, I tore it open. This time, the note read, "You should have left when you had the chance." A chill ran through me, colder than before. The words were no longer just unsettling, they were threatening. My stomach churned, and my eyes frantically scanned the yard, the street. There was no one. Nothing. Yet the sensation that I was being watched didn't fade, it only intensified, the air thick with an oppressive weight, as if something was closing in. I backed into the house, clutching the note in my hand, and slammed the door shut. My mind raced. Who was doing this? Why? What did they mean by "you should have left"? I hadn't gone anywhere. I hadn't done anything. But the note made it sound like I was already in danger, like something was already coming for me. I went to the windows, pulled the blinds open just a crack. The street was quiet, the neighbors going about their day, nothing out of the ordinary. But the air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath, waiting. I checked my phone again, but there were no calls, no messages, no alerts. Whoever was behind this was playing a game, and I was the target. Night fell, but the unease didn't dissipate. Every time I glanced out of the window, there was nothing but shadows, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. That someone was there, waiting, watching, just out of sight. By morning, the realization hit me like a cold slap to the face. The note had said, "I'm closer than you think." As I looked around my house, at the familiar walls, the safe spaces that had once offered comfort, I knew the truth, it wasn't just me. The note itself had been in the mailbox, and now it was here, in my house. Whoever had written it was closer than I thought. They had been here all along. And they were still watching.